My name is Colleen Walsh, 42, the firstborn daughter of the Walsh family. A family rooted in tradition, living by the law, upholding their hopes and unspoken dreams. But in their world of trophies and framed portraits, even my name had been forgotten. My mother used to say, "I don't want you to hear this, but I love you. I'm sorry." I got married for the first time when I was 19. You don't start a dynasty. It's your grandmother who rises and grants you her fleeting grace. But that was the first scar I ever received. I served my country, led soldiers into battle, lived in the darkest corners of the world. But in my own home, I could never live as a visible person. I came home from the war with sand still in my boots and ghosts trailing close behind. But no one asked about them. No parades, no banners, not even a hug. Just a quiet airport gate and a voicemail from my father saying, "You're always so busy." Like I'd missed a family dinner, not 7 months of black ops deep inside borders even diplomats feared to name. I had been trained to disappear. I was fluent in silence, could blend into shadows like vapor. That skill served me well in the field until it followed me home. Because back in my family's world of ceremonies and photo frames, visibility was everything. And me, I was a ghost. Erica, my younger sister, was the crown jewel, lieutenant colonel, poised, polished, public. The living proof that military excellence could be beautiful and well manicured. The kind of daughter who looked perfect framed on a mantle. Me. My story was never printed, classified, redacted, packed away in dusty manila folders and locked briefings no civilian or proud parent could access. I didn't envy my sister's medals. I envied being seen. There was a Thanksgiving. I remember it too clearly, where a neighbor's son got my seat at the table because he'd just been accepted to law school. That night I ate standing at the kitchen sink, my medals still boxed in the garage, unopened. No one noticed. That silence was louder than artillery. It was in those moments, the quiet ones, where being overlooked felt heavier than a rucksack, that I promised myself no more chasing their approval. I had survived enemy fire. I wouldn't beg to survive my own family. And yet, despite every vow to let go, I still returned to Fort Campbell that fall. Not for love, not for nostalgia. I came because Erica was being promoted, and my mother had called not to invite me with warmth, but with instructions. Don't wear anything weird. Don't make her look bad. That was all. I stood alone in the back of the command briefing room, not to speak, not to lead, just to observe. My presence barely warranted a glance, until the door opened. A gust of attention followed a man through it. General Hammond, seasoned, respected, unmistakable. His eyes swept the room like a searchlight, scanning titles and faces. And then he saw me. He stopped mid-step, straightened, then locked eyes. "Ma'am!" he said, his voice cutting through the ambient murmur like a bell. "General Walsh?" Every neck turned, conversation stilled. Even Erica, perched at the podium, froze. Her fingers faltered on the note card. I didn't rise immediately. I held the moment in my palms, feeling it pulse. A recognition I hadn't begged for. A truth too sharp for denial. I stood slowly returning the salute. Not for the applause, but because a man who once trusted me with lives had just reminded the room I existed. The air trembled with silence. Not the kind that dismisses, the kind that commands. That day I didn't just reclaim my name. I cracked the illusion that had wrapped my family like armor, that only the visible are worthy. For once the room wasn't silent for Erica. It was silent for me. The silence that followed wasn't one of dismissal. It was reverence. It wasn't for Erica. It was for me. And in that stillness, I didn't just reclaim my name. I shattered the illusion my family had clung to for years, that only the visible were worthy. But tell me, how do you forgive a family that only sees you when someone more powerful reminds them to look? Recognition is a strange currency. You learn to live without it to adapt. You inhale in shadows and exhale in silence. You train your heartbeat to soften to keep hope from sounding too loud. Years go by like that. Years of being useful but unacknowledged, exceptional but unrecorded. Until one moment unannounced it finds you. Not with noise, but with stillness. A pause so profound it slices through the decades of being invisible. That moment in the briefing room when General Hammond said my name, General Walsh, wasn't just mine. It was a homecoming for every version of myself I'd buried in deserts, bunkers, and redacted reports. The me who stitched up wounded men by flashlight. The me who held the line when others panicked. The me who got on the plane alone and came back alone. None of them had ever been saluted. Not by family. Not by friends. Certainly not by my sister. I didn't sleep that night, not from anxiety, but from the absence of it. I lay in bed not replaying the applause because there wasn't any but that moment when the air changed. When the entire room tilted ever so slightly toward me. I saw Erica falter at the podium. Her voice, always smooth, stumbled for just a beat. That tremble spoke more than any award ever could. Then came the next morning. There was a reception for Erica's promotion, an elegant, well-orchestrated affair with champagne flutes, polished insignias, and the kind of curated pride my family specialized in. I arrived as expected, quiet, composed, already prepared to be overlooked. I didn't bother looking for familiar faces. I knew none would turn toward me first. But General Hammond did. He found me near the back of the room, where the air was less filtered and the hierarchy less polished. He didn't smile, just offered a nod as if recognizing someone who had once shared a trench instead of a table. "You held dagger together when the rest of us were guessing," he said. I froze, not at the words themselves, but at the implication behind them. We didn't forget. I wanted to ask why no one ever told me that. Why those words had to wait until now. But I didn't, because I already knew. In this world, recognition isn't always about merit. It's about timing. And timing isn't always kind. Later, as Erica took the stage, I sat in the third row from the back, wedged between a colonel's aging mother, who smelled like lavender and bitterness, and a fiancé adjusting her blouse more than listening. Erica stood at the podium radiant and composed her medals, catching the light just so. She spoke of loyalty, of duty, of legacy. Then came the pause. Calculated, surgical. "Some walk away from this path," she said, eyes scanning the room, "and in doing so, walk away from honor." There it was. A sentence that didn't carry my name but carried my shape. The kind of sentence you build with intention, not ignorance. A sentence designed not to accuse, but to remind. Subtle enough to be defensible, sharp enough to bleed. I didn't flinch. My hands didn't move. I've held rifles steadier in sandstorms. But inside something shifted, not in pain but in certainty. I looked around the room. Not at Erica, but at the others. The officers, the spouses, the aides. Some were turning their heads, whispers small and sharp like pins pressed into soft fabric. I could see the recognition dawn across a few faces, not all but enough. They were remembering, not names, not missions, just presence. Mine. I hadn't planned to stand, but silence has its own gravity, and suddenly I was rising not for them but for me, General Walsh Hammond had said. It echoed again, not from his voice this time, but from memory. I didn't wave. I didn't smile. I stood tall. I let my posture do the speaking. Let every scar, every sleepless night, every dismissed contribution hang heavy in the air. And for the first time, I didn't shrink. I didn't apologize for taking up space. I didn't try to soften my presence to fit the room. I was the room. And the applause. There wasn't any, but there was stillness, the kind that carries weight, the kind that rewrites family hierarchies without saying a word. I stepped out into the crisp autumn air after the reception. Leaves crunched beneath my boots. Somewhere behind me, the voices continued laughter, rising like bubbles in a glass. But they felt distant now, less like home, more like history. Because here's what I know now. Recognition, when it finally comes, doesn't heal everything, but it names the wound. And sometimes that's the first step toward closing it. So tell me, how many versions of yourself did you have to bury, just to be noticed once? There's a kind of pain that never makes a sound. It doesn't scream or scar. It doesn't leave broken bones or visible wounds. It just settles quietly, methodically into the marrow of who you are. The kind of pain that becomes architecture, permanent, structural. That's the pain I carried through 20 years of silence, and no one in my family ever noticed. They never called me a failure, not once, but they didn't need to. Their silence did the heavy lifting. Their absence from my story spoke louder than any words ever could. While my brother's wedding photos hung proudly in the hallway, his wife's smile immortalized in glossy frames, while Erica's medals caught the morning light from behind, glass immaculate, untouched, my life stayed sealed in steel memory and restricted files. Not because I was ashamed, but because no one ever asked, not once. No one knew about Damascus, about the 6 months I spent underground, masquerading as an embassy clerk, while coordinating the extraction of a double agent who'd been compromised. No one knew that I slept with a pistol under my ribs and cyanide stitched into my coat. No one asked what happened in Libya, where I lived in the walls of a compound for 4 days, unwashed, half-starved, relaying coordinates that saved 30 civilians from mass execution. And no one ever mentioned Candle Strike, the op that left 3 of my men dead, the one that hollowed me out and replaced leadership with something colder endurance. I carried their names. I remembered their faces, the last jokes they cracked, the final words they said before the comms went dark. But when I came home, what did I come back to? I wasn't absent from my family. I was erased. They said I walked away, that I couldn't handle the structure, that I had quit the discipline. But I never quit. I was pulled into silence by necessity, hand-picked for missions so covert they disappeared from records. I didn't get a graduation ceremony. I didn't pose in uniform at the family barbecue. My assignments came in unmarked envelopes. My victories couldn't be toasted. When I sent birthday flowers or holiday cards, they weren't acts of guilt. They were small flares, fired from the dark proof that I was still alive, still trying, still here. Even if they'd already clipped me from the family photo. But the real wound wasn't the forgetting. It was how easy it was for them to forget. One cousin once told me they cropped me out of a family photo to balance the frame. Said it casually, like removing me was an aesthetic choice, not an erasure. As if the issue wasn't what I'd done, but that I didn't fit the picture. For years I tried to decode it. What had I done wrong? Was I too cold? Too quiet? Did I fail some invisible test of daughterhood, the one Erica passed with distinction? But it wasn't about who I was. It was about what I didn't give them. I didn't give them something to show off. I didn't give them Facebook posts or LinkedIn announcements. My missions couldn't be turned into cocktail stories. My silence couldn't be framed. My survival wasn't beautiful enough to display. So they acted like it didn't matter. And yet, I still went back. I still showed up. Not because I wanted their applause, but because I needed once, just once, to see if they could see me. Not as the black sheep, not as the ghost, but as the woman who stood in the fire, not behind it. As the sister who never stopped watching from the shadows. As the daughter who fought for lives they'd never know in places they couldn't pronounce. I wanted to know, would they look at me and not flinch? They didn't. They looked through me, just as they always had. But that's the thing about truth. It doesn't decay in silence. It waits. It calcifies. It sharpens with every dismissal and every shrug. And when it's finally spoken, when it finally enters the room, it doesn't knock softly. It arrives like a storm. Recognition, when it finally found me, came not from home, but from a man in uniform who had trusted me with lives, who had watched me lead, who, in a single word, General Walsh, rewrote everything my family refused to say. That one moment shattered the script they had followed for decades, that only the visible are valuable, that only the celebrated are worthy of love. I had prepared my whole life for battles in foreign countries, for bullets, for betrayal. But nothing prepared me for the quiet war I fought at home. Because here's the truth. You can survive sniper fire in the hills of Afghanistan and still be gutted by a dinner table that no longer holds your name. You can save 30 lives in a Libyan compound and still be forgotten in your childhood living room. You can be a general and still be invisible, until you're not. And once they see you, truly see you, you never go back to shrinking again. I once believed war would be the greatest trial of my life, the long nights, the desert air, thick with gunpowder and uncertainty, the weight of command pressing down like gravity. I thought surviving that was the apex of strength. I was wrong. War teaches you to anticipate danger, to spot the glint of a sniper's lens, to track the flicker of movement behind a crumbling wall. Out there, betrayal wears camouflage and speaks in foreign dialects. But at home, betrayal wears your sister's perfume. It speaks with the voice that once whispered bedtime stories in a shared room. It arrives in an unmarked envelope. The envelope was waiting at the guest quarters after the ceremony. Plain, sealed, deceptively quiet. I remember turning it over in my hand, sensing the weight of something that didn't belong in paper. Inside a scan of an email, anonymous, subject line reckless, Operation Civilian Casualties. It named me. It named Candle Strike. It accused me of unauthorized action, of endangering lives, of hiding the truth under a mountain of red tape. The language wasn't unfamiliar, it was almost too familiar. Word for word, it mirrored a classified after-action report I had reviewed years ago in a concrete bunker beneath Stuttgart. A report that was supposed to remain buried. Only 3 people had ever seen that file. Myself, a lead analyst, and a junior officer who had temporary clearance, Erica. I wanted to believe it was a mistake, a misunderstanding. Even after everything, after the silent Thanksgivings, the cropped photos, the deliberate omission from speeches, I didn't want to believe she would do this. So, I asked her, quietly, privately. I gave her that grace, and she looked me in the eye. Yes, she said. 1 syllable. No shame, no hesitation. I didn't fall apart. I didn't raise my voice. The pain didn't explode, it unfurled slow and steady like smoke from something burning deep beneath the surface. A betrayal this personal doesn't crash in. It coils, wrapping itself around the heart until it chokes something sacred. Why, I asked. Her answer came like a hairline fracture splitting bone. Because you weren't supposed to win. That's what it came down to. She had played by every rule. She stayed visible. She obeyed the script of legacy and public image. But even from the shadows, I had cast too long a silhouette. Even in silence, I had threatened the symmetry of her story. They never stopped talking about you, she said, her voice brittle. Even when you were gone. Even when I did everything right. I thought if I could just erase you, maybe they'd see me. She wasn't a monster. She was a mirror, a reflection of everything our family had bred us to believe, that love was earned through medals, that validation was a competition, that daughters were trophies, and only one could stand on the podium. What she didn't realize was, I had stopped racing a long time ago. I no longer needed the applause. I didn't want to win. I just wanted to exist. And now she had tried to erase even that. I looked at her not with fury, but with something deeper. Pity, grief. Because I understood now Erica wasn't evil. She was still that little girl on the edge of our bunk bed trying to be enough, trying to shine bright enough to deserve the spotlight. And somewhere along the way she decided I was the shadow that dimmed her light. But what she never grasped was this real strength isn't proven by diminishing others. It's proven by refusing to. I could have ended her career. Leaking classified information, even paraphrased, is a federal offense. I had the email. I had the evidence. I had the moral right, but I didn't. I walked away. Not because I was weak, but because I had learned something she hadn't. You don't use your wounds as weapons. You don't heal by cutting someone else open. That night I stepped out into the cold air with the envelope still in my hand. My fingers didn't tremble from rage, but from the kind of sadness that lingers in your ribs. Not sadness for me, for her. Because it wasn't just a betrayal of trust. It was a betrayal of blood. It was the shattering of every shared childhood memory, every pinky promise, every scraped knee bandaged by the other's hand. It was the moment I realized the person who stabbed me hadn't come from across a battlefield. She came from my own home. And that kind of betrayal, it doesn't scar. It haunts. I tried to walk away. I told myself that confronting Erica was the end of it, that once the truth was spoken, it would be enough to close the chapter. But some truths don't just want to be heard. They demand to be seen, felt deep in the bones, and acted upon. 3 days after that conversation, the calm shattered. The base erupted in protocol red. An emergency alert buzzed urgently through my phone. This was no drill, no test. It was real. A classified file tied to Operation Candlestrike had been leaked. Not whispered behind closed doors, not speculated in hushed tones, but leaked online, encrypted yet public enough to raise every alarm. Within the hour, I was seated across from General Hammond, flanked by 2 military intelligence officers. Their faces weren't hostile, but their eyes searched me carefully, weighing every ounce of truth and implication. "We've traced the source," one said, sliding a folder toward me. "The point of origin leads back to Fort Campbell, to a dormant device once assigned to you." My chest didn't tighten. Instead, it hardened like bolting a door shut from the inside. I requested access to metadata and a full chain of custody review. I wasn't just a name on the file. I had clearance rights and the one thing everyone else seemed to forget: nothing left to lose. What I uncovered changed everything. The leak hadn't come from malice, but from recklessness. A forgotten backup server, an unsecured link, and most damningly, an access credential still active and tied to Erica. She had logged in 2 days before the ceremony, claiming she'd left her laptop unlocked in the comms room, a careless mistake that became catastrophic. I remembered how calm she'd looked. Too calm, too rehearsed, like someone waiting for something to break, hoping it wouldn't be loud. The damage was wider than either of us imagined. A dormant process had attached that classified file to an email she thought was harmless, a ghost in the system that spread far beyond control. I could have buried it, pretended it ended with her confession. But the breach was no longer personal. It was institutional. After wearing the uniform long enough, I'd learned you don't just protect people, you protect the truth. So I stood, not in rage, not in revenge, But in duty, I requested to lead the internal investigation, not to save her, but to save what still mattered the core of our service, the code we lived by, the belief that honor cannot be built on silence or sabotage. General Hammond looked at me long and hard, then nodded. "The floor is yours, General Walsh." And just like that, I stepped into the role I had always held, but never been allowed to name. Not ghost, leader. You never expect war to follow you into family meetings. Yet that's exactly the weight I carried as I stepped into the task force briefing room, the room humming with tension, my name pinned on the board not as a suspect, not merely as a soldier, but as the one tasked with cleaning the blood off someone else's careless hands. The weight of blame wasn't new, but this time, it was wrapped in the voices I once trusted most. General Hammond didn't assign me strangers. Instead, he gave me my family a bitter twist of fate that turned a professional investigation into a personal reckoning. My father, Colonel Roy Walsh, sat with a calm that barely masked the storm, beneath responsible for managing archive access. Erica, still sharp in her uniform, was handed the duty of tracing internal system vulnerabilities. And my mother, who had once been a fierce combat medic but now seemed like a shadow of her former self, was charged with overseeing digital trace recovery from Erica's abandoned laptop. The reunion was colder than any battlefield I had ever known. The long table between us felt less like a place for collaboration and more like a no-man's land. My father's voice was steady but hollow as he presented his intel a litany of data and breaches that felt like an obituary for the trust we once had. Erica didn't raise her eyes once. Her silence was a shield or maybe a surrender. My mother, usually the pillar of strength, was withdrawn, her eyes darting nervously between the two of us as if she were watching strangers inhabit the bodies of her children. But I didn't come seeking warmth. I came demanding the truth. And the truth arrived like a siren, wailing through static. Our AI systems had detected a dormant Trojan buried deep inside a logistics file from 2017, not just any file, but a carefully concealed shell embedded within a campaign archive from Mosul, the year I had locked horns with Derek Glade. Derek Glade, the strategist with the silver tongue and ruthless tactics that left scorched earth in his wake. Our conflict had been fierce. He pushed for sweeping operations through civilian zones. I stood firm, demanding restraint. He called my caution weakness. I called it honor. I won the battle and denied him clearance. But he never forgot. Unbeknownst to us all, he had embedded a Trojan that lurked in our systems, waiting patiently. Erica, with her unguarded login, had unknowingly triggered the beast. He never needed to break in. We had fractured ourselves from within. My mother slid a folder across the table, a forgotten printout of Candlestrike's field log. Her voice was barely a whisper as she said, "You left this behind. Back then I thought you were hiding. Now I see you were just surviving." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something heavier, an acknowledgement, a reckoning with all the things left unsaid. Then came the final blow, a login ping traced to a remote IP address, a motel Wi-Fi just beyond the base perimeter. The name on the reservation sent a chill down my spine. Derek Glade. He was here, watching us, waiting in the shadows. He hadn't broken in. He had waited patiently, letting our own weaknesses consume us. He watched as we burned from the inside, and for a moment, it almost succeeded. The raid happened at 0400, quiet, surgical, deliberate. No alarms pierced the darkness, only the steady rhythm of boots striking concrete, and the faint, chilling click of weapons being drawn. We moved like ghosts through the shadows, advancing toward the decommissioned tech relay, an old bunker abandoned for 5 long years, swallowed by silence and dust. Derek Glade was exactly where we expected him, alone, Hunched over a military-grade transmitter, his eyes locked onto the terminal with an intensity that dared to challenge the very concept of justice. He didn't run. He didn't flinch. Instead, he looked up and met my gaze. "Took you long enough?" he said, his voice calm, almost amused. I said nothing. I let the silence stretch between us thick, heavy, the same silence he had tried so hard to bury me in all those years. A silence that tried to erase me, to drown me in shadows. During interrogation, Derek confessed with a surgical precision that chilled me. Not out of guilt or remorse, but pure calculation. He delivered his debrief like a man reading from a carefully prepared script. "You rose too fast," he said. "People stopped questioning you. The leak was supposed to humble you, strip you of your clearance, cut off your access to the real power, not kill you, just remove you. But he underestimated me. He believed that visibility was the only thing I had earned, the only thing that mattered. What he forgot was that I had survived invisibility." I walked out of that cell with my boots echoing against the sterile floor, steady and unbroken. Behind me, Derek sat alone, the walls closing in, not because of the bars that trapped him, but because he finally understood he'd lost a war years ago. Not fought with guns or bombs, but waged with grudges and shadows. After Derek was gone, silence returned, but it was different this time. Not the cold, dismissive silence I had grown used to over years of neglect and absence. This was a silence heavy with recognition, burdened with accountability, and thick with the weight of truths that could no longer be buried under the guise of convenience or denial. It wasn't comfortable or easy. It was a fragile truce, a quiet that demanded attention. We reconvened in the same briefing room where battles had been waged, both professional and deeply personal. The walls had witnessed our fractures, our silences, and now they bore witness to a family gathered in the wreckage of what had been done and what had long been left unsaid. Gone were the uniforms and the rigid formalities. Stripped away were the shields of rank and protocol. What remained were people raw and exposed, forced to face each other and the consequences of their choices. Erica came in last. She didn't immediately take her seat. Instead, she lingered by the window, arms crossed not as an act of defiance, but as a shield to hold herself together. I knew that posture intimately. I had worn it too, the armor of guarded vulnerability, the stance of someone bracing against a storm of regret and shame. My father cleared his throat. He looked down at the notepad in front of him, but it was clear he wasn't reading. He was hiding behind it, wrestling with words he'd never found the courage to say before. Finally, he spoke, voice rough with years of unspoken truth. "I owe this team an apology," he said. "Especially you, Colleen." His eyes met mine for a fleeting moment, an unspoken acknowledgement of the burden I'd carried alone. I let pride blind me. I let protocol replace presence. I was too concerned with appearances to see what was right in front of me. Those words struck harder than any reprimand or report. It was the first time I heard my father admit he was wrong, not in a vague, distant way, but with a sincerity that peeled away years of cold distance. The apology was a crack in the fortress we'd built around ourselves. Erica finally turned from the window. Her voice was low, steady, but tinged with something I hadn't heard from her before. Remorse. I didn't know what I triggered. I didn't know Derek would. Her sentence faltered, unfinished. The weight of responsibility sat heavy between us. I nodded. I know, but intent still matters. She blinked rapidly, fighting tears that refused to fall. Pride, that stubborn guardian, held them back, always had. My mother reached into a folder and slid a document across the table, a printout that felt heavier than any medal or commendation. It was Erica's signed addendum, an official statement of responsibility. A reprimand that would cost her the chance at promotion eligibility for the next 5 years. She volunteered it, my mother said quietly, eyes fixed on the paper. No one asked. That act, unprompted, unforced, spoke volumes. It was the first real ownership I'd seen from Erica. No excuses, no deflections, just accountability. I looked across the table at the faces around me. For the first time in a long time, I didn't see enemies or competitors. I saw people, flawed, frightened, scarred by their own battles, but trying. Trying was enough. Sometimes it was all anyone could ask for. Later that night, I returned to my quarters alone. The quiet was different now, less hollow, more reflective. I poured a glass of water and sat at my desk, eyes fixed on the manila envelope that still rested there. Not the one from Derek, this was the one from Erica. The one I'd kept folded carefully among memories and old wounds. It no longer felt like a weapon. It no longer carried the sting of betrayal. It felt like a scar. And scars, no matter how jagged or tender, mean that healing has begun, that the body has fought back, that survival is not just about enduring the pain, but transforming it. The next morning we gathered once more, one final time. No orders were barked, no missions planned, just family. Imperfect, fragile, but family, nonetheless. And this time, my seat wasn't handed off to someone else. It wasn't a place of invisibility or silent accusation. It had my name on it, written clearly, finally. I sat there surrounded by the people who had once looked through me, feeling something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years belonging. In the days that followed, a subtle but irreversible transformation began to take hold within the fragile fabric of our family. It wasn't announced with fanfare or marked by any ceremonial gesture. No one stood up to declare a new beginning, and yet the air itself seemed to change, shifting imperceptibly, but undeniably. The walls that had long echoed with silence and unspoken grievances started to absorb a new kind of sound, the quiet murmur of tentative reconciliation. It was in the smallest moments, the ones that often go unnoticed but carry the heaviest meaning. I noticed it first in my father. The man who had once seemed like an unyielding pillar of discipline and distance suddenly lingered in conversations with me. He no longer glanced away after issuing commands or dismissed my presence with a curt nod. Instead, his eyes met mine, steady but softened by a hint of something I hadn't seen before. Perhaps curiosity, perhaps regret. He asked questions that went beyond the surface, questions that suggested he was trying to bridge the years of absence with tentative words. His voice, usually clipped and authoritative, now carried a gentler cadence, as if he was learning to speak a language he had long forgotten. My mother's change was more delicate, less spoken, but equally profound. One evening, long after the formalities had ended, she paused outside my quarters. There was no clipboard in her hand, no uniform to remind me of the woman she once was. Instead, there was a vulnerability in her gaze as she asked if I was sleeping well, not out of routine, but genuine concern. Her words trembled slightly as though she feared rejection, but they carried the warmth of a mother's care that had been buried under layers of silence and distance. It was a simple question, yet it felt like an olive branch extended across years of estrangement. Erica's transformation was perhaps the hardest to witness, yet the most hopeful. For so long her voice had skirted around my name, fragile and hesitant, as if speaking it aloud might shatter the delicate walls she had built between us. But now she began to say it openly, firmly, as if claiming me back into the fold of our fractured family. It was no longer a whispered token, but a solid acknowledgement of my presence and place among them. The change was subtle, but I caught it the way her eyes met mine, without avoidance. the way she no longer recoiled at the sight of my face. It was as though we were learning to rebuild a bridge that had long been broken plank by careful plank. One evening, as the sky deepened into dusk and shadows stretched long across the base, I found Erica waiting outside my quarters. There was no clipboard clutched in her hands, no uniform to mark her role or rank, just a simple file held firmly, yet with a reverence I hadn't expected. Her posture was calm but resolute, a quiet determination that spoke volumes. "It's a proposal," she said before I could ask. "Based on your candle strike tactics, training reforms." I took the file from her hands, my fingers brushing against the worn edges. Flipping through the pages, I found precise, thoughtful recommendations rooted in the very doctrines I had once fought to uphold in silence. The proposal was comprehensive, reflecting a deep understanding of the strategies and lessons gleaned from harsh realities and hard-won experience. Each section spoke to a desire not only to improve, but to honor the sacrifices made by those who served. "I don't need your signature," Erica added quietly, her eyes searching mine. I want to know what you think." I picked up a pen and with deliberate strokes wrote a single word on the cover: "Advance." She didn't smile, but there was a shift, a subtle straightening of her shoulders, a new lightness in the way she stood. It was the first sign of a thaw, a glimmer of something better emerging from the long winter of our family's silence. Later that night, I sat alone on the barrack steps, the cool air wrapping around me like a balm. Above a tapestry of stars stretched endlessly silent witnesses to the passage of time and the slow work of healing. The wind rolled through the treetops, stirring the leaves with a soft rustle that carried memories of those first days after my return from war. Days filled with tension, vigilance, and the sharp edge of survival. But now the wind's whisper was different. It was softer, gentler. It was the sound of peace learning how to speak again, slowly and hesitantly, but with a promise of something new. I closed my eyes and let the moment settle, feeling the weight of the past and the fragile hope of what lay ahead. The road to reconciliation was long and uncertain, but for the first time in years I felt ready to walk it. The invitation arrived folded with precision. No wax seal, no ornate flourish, just a single stark line typed above the briefing title: "Redefining Shadow Warfare, Post-Conflict Intelligence in Asymmetric Environments." It was simple, direct, but carried a weight I hadn't felt in years. 62 commanders from every branch, 30 high-ranking advisors whose names alone commanded respect. Nearly 100 observers, analysts, and strategists, all gathered in one room. And then there was me. I stood backstage beneath the low hum of projectors, the faint rustle of papers, and the dense weight of a silence I hadn't feared in a long time. This wasn't a battle for recognition or a fight to carve out space. I already had it. My name was printed boldly on the official schedule. No asterisks, no footnotes. Not sister of or acting, just General Colleen Walsh. As I walked to the podium, I carried nothing but a pointer and a lifetime of scars, some too deep and jagged to name aloud. No flags draped my shoulders, no medals pinned to my chest. The past was heavy, but the room was still. My eyes searched the crowd until they landed on her, Erica. Front row pen, poised eyes locked on mine. There was no challenge there, no bitterness, just a steady readiness to listen to understand. I began without hesitation or apology. Some missions, I said slowly, don't get names. Some leaders never receive plaques or medals. And some battles start not at distant borders or contested front lines, but right here at kitchen tables. The room remained silent. No coughs, no shifting in seats, just an almost palpable stillness, as if everyone was holding their breath. I spoke plainly about the candle strike decision, the override I signed that spared a hostile zone because 7 children were still trapped inside. A choice that nearly ended my career. A choice that had defined me. "I'd do it again," I said firmly, because leadership isn't about being the loudest voice in the room. It's about carrying the weight of silence when others can't. It's about bearing the burden of decisions no one else wants to face. There were no gasps, no whispered criticisms. Instead, a quiet recalibration settled over the audience, a reckoning with the true cost of command. When I finished, I stepped aside and turned to the auxiliary microphone. "I've asked someone to join me," I said, voice steady but sincere. Someone who has learned that strength doesn't come from erasing others, but in standing beside them. Erica rose. Her voice was not flawless. There were cracks, moments of hesitation, but it carried something far more powerful, honesty. "I used to think honor meant climbing the highest ladder alone," she said, looking toward the audience, and then back at me. "But today I know true honor is recognizing whose shoulders you've stood on." The applause was not thunderous. It was deeper than that. It was earned. It was respect distilled from years of pain, conflict, and hard-won understanding. In the back row, my mother did not clap, but she nodded, just once. A simple gesture, but it held worlds of meaning. For the first time, it felt like she truly saw me. Not through the glitter of medals, not through the shadows of shame, but through the clear, unvarnished lens of clarity and truth. And in that moment, I realized that this room, this gathering, this fragile bridge between us was not an end, but a beginning. A beginning of something stronger, built not on division or silence, but on acknowledgement, resilience, and the unyielding bond of family. After the conference ended, I lingered in the empty hall for a while. The chairs were half-stacked, abandoned mid-task, and the air still held the charged residue of what had just passed. Words spoken, truths faced, judgments passed. On a nearby table lay a notepad left behind by someone who had clearly been moved, but unsure how to express it. At the top of the page, a single line was scribbled raw and unfiltered. She changed the temperature of the room. It wasn't a compliment, not quite. It felt heavier, like a verdict delivered quietly, weighing every decision, every unspoken question. A recognition of disruption, a reckoning with presence. I stepped out into the corridor. There, waiting quietly, stood a young cadet clutching his cap like it was armor against the unknown. His eyes were wide, hopeful, untouched by the battles I'd faced. He hesitated, then asked softly, "Ma'am, in war, what's the hardest part?" I looked at him, so young, so full of potential, so unscarred. The weight of years pressed down behind my gaze, but I answered honestly. "Surviving," I said, "without turning your wounds into weapons. Without becoming the statue they expect you to be, frozen, untouchable, and silent." He nodded slowly, as if weighing the gravity of those words. Then, with a crisp salute, he said, "Thank you for coming back." That night, I returned to my quarters. I opened the window, letting the cool dusk air wash over me. Across the base, drills had finally ended. One by one, the lights blinked out in perfect unison, like stars giving up their pretense of permanence. On my desk sat a small plastic container, incongruous in its simplicity, amid the echoes of the day. Inside was a birthday cake, blue icing, delicately scripted with 3 words that struck a chord deeper than any medal ever could. General, sister, teacher. I didn't cry, not then. Instead, I simply breathed, fully, deeply. For once, not as a soldier hardened by war, nor as a ghost erased by silence, but just as myself. A week after the conference, I sent out 3 invitations. One to my father, Colonel Roy Walsh, one to my mother, Marilyn, and one to Erica. No explanations accompanied them. No long letters or pleas. Just a simple note, clean black font stating a time, a date, and a location. The old family house, the one perched on the edge of Fort Campbell, where the walls still held the faint scent of polished pride and years of memories both bitter and sweet. This time, I arrived first. I took my time setting the table. 6 chairs. Not 5, not 4, 6. Because this gathering wasn't about convenience or compromise. It was about reclamation. I placed my chair at the head of the table. Not to assert authority or command. Not to remind them of rank or history. But because I needed to stop waiting for permission to belong. When they arrived, the air was thick with unspoken words. No one spoke first. My mother carried a dish wrapped carefully in foil, a gesture of tentative peace. Erica avoided my eyes, her hands clenched softly at her sides, as if bracing herself for what was to come. My father's face was unreadable sharp angles, softened only by the years still a mask of command and control. We sat. No polite greetings, no forced smiles or hollow laughter. Just breath, just presence. I cleared my throat, the sound loud in the sudden stillness. I didn't call this dinner for apologies. I began voice steady but vulnerable. I called it for truth. And so, I told them everything. I told them I hadn't quit West Point, that I had been recruited for missions so secret that no one outside a select few even knew they existed, that I had made decisions in the shadows, decisions that tore me open from the inside, that I had lost people I cared about, friends, comrades, fragments of myself that I might never reclaim. I spoke of Syria, the endless days buried deep in hostile compounds, the months lost on foreign soil that stained more than just my boots. I told them about the choices that haunted me, the victories I declined to claim not out of modesty, but because some triumphs were too costly to be displayed in glass cases. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't plead for their belief. I only asked them to listen. When I finished, the room didn't erupt with anger or denial. Instead, it exhaled a collective release of breath, heavy with understanding tension, and years of silence breaking. My mother whispered, her voice trembling with regret. I thought those care packages you sent were your way of saying sorry. I shook my head slowly. They weren't apologies, I said quietly. They were reminders. Reminders that I still existed even after you edited me out of every frame. I reached beneath the table and placed a manila folder in front of Erica. The email. The one she had sent that nearly cost me everything. I didn't keep this to incriminate you, I said, meeting her eyes. I kept it to remind you that words don't vanish just because we pretend they were never spoken. She looked down, the silence washing over her face. Then she looked up and said nothing, but she placed her hand over the folder. Not to conceal it, but to acknowledge it. My father rose, then his footsteps steady but heavy. He walked to the mantel and picked up a family photo, one worn with time edges, curling faces faded by years. This one's missing someone. He murmured, voice thick with unspoken apology. He turned toward me, eyes softening in a way I hadn't seen in years. We'll take a new one, he said. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I simply nodded. Not because I forgave them, but because I no longer needed to carry the weight of what they forgot to hold. Because for the first time I was ready to lay down my own burden and perhaps to begin healing the fractures that had kept us apart for far too long. A month after that long-awaited dinner, I returned to Washington District of Columbia. Not as a shadow lurking in the background, not as a secret whispered only among a select few, but as a strategist, fully present, fully acknowledged. The weight I had carried for so long was beginning to lift, replaced by a steady rhythm of purpose and progress. My days settled into a quiet cadence. Briefings unfolded with practiced precision. Intelligence analyses filled pages in neat black ink, and occasional meetings buzzed with the energy of planning and possibility. Once a month I taught a course at Fort Campbell, a place I once haunted as a ghost, now visited as a leader. The syllabus bore my name boldly. No footnotes, no disclaimers, just Colleen Walsh. Erica never missed a class. She sat squarely in the front row, pen in hand, eyes sharp and attentive. She asked hard questions, questions that cut beneath the surface, but she listened with an openness I hadn't seen in years. Our dynamic was no longer one of silent rivalry or unspoken blame. It had shifted into a dialogue, a fragile collaboration. One day after a lecture on field ethics, a topic close to my heart, Erica lingered behind. She approached me with a thin binder held carefully in her hands. Training reform proposal, she said, voice steady but earnest. It's based on your operations model. I thought it might be a start. I took the binder and flipped through the pages. The work was meticulous, sharp, infused with the practical wisdom of someone who had wrestled with the realities of command and consequence. She didn't ask for my validation. There was no need. Instead, she asked something far more important. What do you think? Without hesitation, I picked up a pen and wrote one word boldly on the cover: advance. The word felt like a quiet promise, a step forward, not a declaration that all was healed, but an acknowledgement that motion itself was progress. The family, fragile and battered, existed now in a quiet kind of movement. It wasn't a resolution, not yet, but it was a dance, sometimes awkward, sometimes hopeful, always imperfect. My mother began sending handwritten notes once a month, usually just one line. Are you eating enough simple words laden with the weight of newfound care? My father started telling people new things. My daughter advises high-level strategy for NATO, instead of the vague, she's stationed overseas somewhere. It was progress, small but meaningful, like the first rays of dawn breaking through a long night. There still wasn't a new family photo, but the last time I looked at the one resting on the mantel edges, curling faces faded, I wasn't missing anymore. I was there, fully, not replaced, not erased, seen. One afternoon after class, a cadet stopped me. Barely 23 nerves palpable, but courage shining through his uncertainty. "Ma'am?" he asked, voice earnest. "What's the hardest part of war?" I didn't answer right away. I held his gaze, searching for the right words, words that could hold truth without shattering hope. Finally, I said, "Surviving without becoming a statue, without letting your wounds harden into weapons, without forgetting how to live after you fought." He nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of that truth. That night, I walked behind the training barracks. The sky stretched wide, glowing orange gold as the sun dipped low. The world felt both vast and intimate in that moment. Erica appeared beside me carrying something small but precious, a birthday cake in a plastic container. Blue icing, simple script, general, sister, teacher. No applause greeted it. No anthem swelled in the background. Just understanding. And in that quiet acceptance, I finally knew this. They didn't need to rewrite the past. They just had to stop pretending I hadn't been there all along. Some stories don't end with a climax. They don't explode. They echo. Mine was never about medals or titles. It was about space, about whether I was allowed to take any. And in the end, I did. Not by shouting louder, but by standing still until the silence gave way. There are no documentaries about what I've done, no best-selling memoirs, just lessons taught quietly, in rooms that used to lock me out. I still wake early, still tie my boots the same way, still write in black ink, but now I live differently. I speak less from survival, more from choice. I listen with ears trained for what's unsaid, and I love carefully, fiercely, the way a soldier learns to love without guarantees. My mother still signs her notes, "Love always, Mom." My father still asks if I've thought about publishing. Erica now signs her proposals with a tiny penciled star in the corner. I never asked what it means. I think I know. And me. I keep the envelope, the one that almost broke me. Not out of spite, but because we should keep reminders not of betrayal but of survival. Because survival, when done right, becomes something else. A legacy. And if there's one thing I've learned through every mile mission, silence and scar, it's this. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is stay. Not to fight, not to fix, just to be. Visible, and enough. But before peace settled in, fully one shadow still remained. He had always hated me. Not with open contempt, but with something colder, calculation. Major Derek Glade was the kind of man who smiled through sabotage and shook your hand while cutting off your escape. He believed in winning at any cost. I was the cost he'd never been allowed to collect. When I blocked his clearance op in Mosul, I became a threat. But it wasn't until I came back survived, Rose stood tall, without permission, that he began to unravel. Not visibly, strategically. And when the leak fell apart, when his name was exposed, when his hands were cuffed and the room watched him fall, he didn't scream. He smiled. "Tell me something, Walsh," he said, his voice low and venom-slick. "If I hadn't tried to erase you, do you really think they ever would have seen you?" For a moment, I didn't respond. Then I leaned close, my voice steady as steel. No Glade. But now they do, and they'll never forget why. Even in chains, he looked pleased, as if he still believed he'd written part of my story. But the difference between a saboteur and a soldier is this one breaks to destroy, the other breaks to rebuild. And I rebuilt everything he tried to burn. Questions to leave. With what part of yourself have you spent your whole life trying to justify in silence? If someone tried to erase your story, would you be ready to tell it anyway? Thank you for reading iStory. For every person who's ever been overlooked, outshined, or erased, you are not alone. And you are never too late to be seen.